Hi there. Welcome to this episode for the Sibylline Insight Podcast Cyber Special. Today, I'll be speaking with Denise Shapani, an associate analyst on the Cyber Desk, to discuss the increased cooperation between state-sponsored actors and cybercriminals. Thank you so much, Denise, for making some time today to chat. So recently, you've written a report regarding state-sponsored cyber threat actors working alongside cyber criminal threat actors. Could you kind of give us the, TLDR, what's the key points that were made in this report to kind of kick us off?
Yeah, of course. This report started actually from reading about this trend towards the end of last year, concerning increased cooperation between state-sponsored actors and cybercriminal actors. And when we mention state-sponsored actors, particularly from China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia as well. And more recently as well, we have seen the company Google actually advocating for a more holistic approach to cybersecurity, citing concerns of increased cooperation between state-sponsored actors and cybercriminals as well, which they do assess might increase security risks for global businesses. And so the report kind of looks at different avenues of cooperation and what the cooperation between these two types of actors could entail, and what the kind of emerging risks are from this increase in cooperation and collaboration as well.
So thank you. So with that then, what were some of the key points from the report that you thought would be important to highlight, especially for our customers, this kind of idea that cyber criminals and state-sponsored actors are collaborating and working together? And what does that then mean for business risk and business security?
So the very first thing that we looked at in the report is is increased cooperations in terms of increased use and adoption of cybercriminals' tactics, tools, and infrastructure by state-sponsored actors. So we've seen a few examples of this in the last few months, primarily by Russian and Chinese state-sponsored actors. And we kind of looked at how this intertwines with cybercriminal ecosystems and the kind of commercialization and diversification of cybercriminal forums and the dark web. So in particular, for example, the Russian state-sponsored group Sandworm actually conducted this cyber espionage operation against Windows users in Ukraine. And during this operation, they used a specific type of malware, which was actually developed by an unnamed cybercriminal group. And so this is kind of one of the examples of Russian state-sponsored groups using tools developed by cybercriminals. And another example, when we look at Russian actors, is also another group, Terla, using actually cybercriminal infrastructure to then conduct their cyber attacks. And in this case, it was a botnet developed by a cybercriminal group, and it was used to then deploy two backdoors, and maintain persistence within Ukrainian military targets. So again, we see kind of in the context of the war in Ukraine, Russian state-sponsored actors really leveraging cybercriminals' tools to conduct operations, looking at sort of the commercialization, especially of cybercriminal tools and the profit that cybercriminal actors have been able to make in 2024 from selling malware, selling access to infrastructure, and also subscription services. This really does contribute to the creation of more resource-rich cybercriminal ecosystems, which can then be exploited by state-sponsored actors to really streamline their operations. It allows them to offset costs, resources, and workloads that are associated with these types of cyber operations, which can obviously be quite costly to conduct, especially at that kind of level of sophistication. And so they really just kind of provide these tools to be able to target adversaries without really spending the time and investing the resources to develop them. And so that's kind of the first trend that we've seen, really just how these resource-rich cybercriminal ecosystems will likely kind of contribute to increased cooperation between state-sponsored actors and cybercriminal groups as well.
Amazing. Thank you. That's really, really interesting. So as you said, it's increasing the availability of resources. And also it sounds like streamlining a lot of these operations. So state-sponsored actors can either conduct larger scale operations, or can target a lot more victims. Is that kind of also what we're seeing? Is it's being used to save the costs but also save the time and, as you said, the resources, so that they can actually maybe target a lot more organizations, as well as maybe have a lot larger scale, just in terms of kind of the scale and breadth of these attacks as well. Is that kind of also maybe what we're seeing on the flip side of the other benefits for utilizing these cybercriminal tools and infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think it definitely provides actors with just sort of highly sophisticated tools, as we've said, without necessarily investing that time. So it definitely cuts timing. But it allows that kind of level of sophistication, relying on really the diversification of cybercriminal forums and the dark web. Obviously, cybercriminals are driven by profit, and so they can spend kind of the time and resources to create these highly sophisticated tools, which then state-sponsored actors can simply adopt in their operations. And so that can kind of contribute. There is a possibility that it will contribute to a higher volume of cyber attacks, and also a wider reach in that sense, purely because it really does sort of offset those costs, workload, timings, and resources.
So with these sort of operations that we're then seeing kind of between this collaboration, is this then affecting, organizations being able to attribute campaigns properly? Is that maybe some of the motivation? When we also talk about costs, like the cyber criminal side, are they trying to make money? And maybe in theory, it saves state-sponsored actors money of having to develop these things themselves. So it saves resources that way. But is with the costs of a lot of these operations still, is that not also contributing to kind of additional costs for state-sponsored actors? So I know those are a few different questions, but kind of what are your thoughts on both of those?
So starting with attribution, I would say that's definitely an important consideration to make when looking at this trend of increased cooperation. So we've seen, for example, Chinese state-sponsored groups using ransomware variants. And as we know, ransomware variants are typically associated with cybercriminal groups and kind of financially motivated operations. And in one specific instance, which was actually reported in February, we have seen the deployment of this ransomware variant by a Chinese state group, and we kind of know that the operation was attributed to the state group based on tactics and tools used. But at the same time, looking at the ransomware variant, it was displaying kind of low sophistication because it had no kind of detection evasion capabilities, for example. During the attack, we also saw the actors, they did not exfiltrate any data prior to encrypting the files, which obviously, once the ransom kind of demand has been made, it's one less way of being able to coerce the victims into kind of paying that ransom. And so all of this kind of points to the fact that the actors likely intended to infiltrate the systems for espionage purposes, and then possibly deployed this ransomware variant to erase evidence and complicate kind of the attribution of the operation. So we know that that's possibly one of the motivations behind using these types of tools. And whilst we do now have more data on how, for example, Chinese state-sponsored actors operate, and so we can occasionally attribute operations, the use of these types of tools definitely increase the likelihood that they could be misattributed. And also, that's possibly one of the motivations. And if we look at also the use of ransomware, for example, which does cause disruption to adversarial systems, it could also allow state-sponsored actors to, in a way, directly target their adversaries with more disruptive impacts. And this is because generally, as we look at state cyber operations, they typically are used as gray zone tactics and within sort of hybrid threats. And so they obviously remain below the threshold of what we would consider an act of war. But generally, again, because they do they do create that extra confusion in terms of the attribution of operations, there is more of an incentive to be potentially more disruptive. And so it does create issues around attribution, but it also will likely raise disruption risks for the kind of adversarial entities to these kind of state-sponsored group.
Thank you, Denise. And for our YouTube viewers, you'll notice that there are some slight differences to the backdrop as we've had to film this episode in 2 parts. So, Denise, following your last response, we were talking about attribution of things related to kind of state actors utilizing cybercriminal tactics. Does it not seem relatively short-sighted to utilize a lot of commonly and well-known cybercriminal tactics and infrastructure, even though in the short term it helps facilitate their operations, streamlines them, reduces the strain on their own resources, but it might increase the possibility of detections and the discoveries of these sorts of operations. So it seems a bit short-sighted that the cyber criminal tactics would be adopted. What are your thoughts on this?
It can be short-sighted. As we were discussing earlier, we obviously have a lot more data now, which helps us with attribution. So while one of the motivations for using cybercriminal tactics can be to complicate attribution and to kind of more directly target adversaries, it can at the same time, as we're speaking now, kind of work against state-sponsored actors because we do have more data, we do have more intelligence on all of these operations. And so again, we can then get to that attribution, which is also how we know that there is kind of increased cooperation between the two groups. However, at the same time, I think there's 2 important points to make there, which is when it comes to cyber capabilities, especially in relations to cybercriminal ecosystems, cybercriminals are consistently and routinely developing new malware tools, more sophisticated capabilities, specifically focusing on the development of better detection evasion. They obviously have better knowledge of security mechanisms, security tools, and on how to evade them. And so this is something that obviously can be remedied as we're speaking now with the development of better capabilities, which is something that I think needs to be taken into account. Although obviously it's not perfect, but definitely an element to consider there. And then I would say another point is also the fact that not only are state-sponsored groups adopting cybercriminal tactics and tools, but on occasion we have seen state-sponsored groups outsourcing campaigns to cybercriminals, and so actual cybercriminal groups conducting operations on behalf of the state, which obviously in this case makes it more difficult to actually directly then attribute the operation to a state entity, because it is in effect being carried out by a cybercriminal group, which can sort of be aligned with the government, but they do tend to do it for financial profit. So again, it adds that kind of extra layer of complication to attribution. So it can be short-sighted, but at the same time, there is a lot of elements that need to be considered there. And it definitely sort of adds that layer of complication to this whole process of attributing an operation, which is obviously helpful for state-sponsored groups.
Interesting. So then kind of related to that, you mentioned the, collaboration between the two and the report as well, talking about it's increasing. And we're seeing it quite often of reports, both in the open source and even in our own reporting that we do here at Sibylline, that there is, these kind of cooperative and collaborative relationships between certain state-sponsored actors and cyber criminals. But is this actually increasing at this very moment? Because we've seen this for, the last several years of certain state-sponsored actors adopting cyber criminal tactics. So is it a case, in your opinion, that it's actually increasing at the moment? Are we just more frequently reporting on it because we now have stronger security detections and a stronger CTI community that we're, information sharing and able to kind of discern what certain state-sponsored actors, TTPs are, and who they're associated with, and same with cyber criminals? So are we then just kind of now seeing a lot more of the overlap between these because maybe of this information sharing and collaborative CTI element? Or do you think there's actually potentially an element of genuine increase in collaboration between these groups? Or could it even be both, or, a variety of different reasons? What are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's likely both. So it's definitely the fact that we are better at detecting these operations, but there also possibly is an increase in kind of sharing of tactics, tools, infrastructure, and just working together. As I briefly mentioned earlier, we have kind of better intelligence, more data, also increased intelligence sharing as well, sometimes within like public and private sector, for example, which obviously means more data, which means being able to kind of attribute more operations, for example, of being able to kind of detect more elements of that operation, and just really kind of identifying, for example, infrastructure groups. So definitely more data, which helps with detection and attribution as well, and also just kind of better security tools in general, which obviously help that with that detection as well. So in a way, I do think that it's obviously the improvement and the development of those tools and our knowledge that has brought this issue to light a little bit more over the last year or so. But at the same time, just to bring it back to what we discussed at the beginning of the podcast, is also the sort of cybercriminal ecosystem, and also the really kind of commercial component of cybercriminal forums, and also the dark web, which has definitely developed and evolved in the last few years. So we discussed, for example, subscription services or initial access broker services, where cybercriminals are really capitalizing on all of these different types of services that they can now offer, which has kind of contributed to, as we were saying, diversifying malware, diversifying tactics, which obviously offers a lot more tools for state-sponsored actors to then be able to kind of offset those resources. So it's definitely an incentive for increased cooperation, which likely means that there is an actual increase alongside the fact that we are just better at detecting instances of cooperation. So I would say it's definitely both.
Interesting. Similar to, the CTI community having better collaboration with each other. It's on the flip side as well for malicious actors that, the increased collaboration also helps. And cyber criminals are probably able to adapt and, develop their tools and infrastructure a lot more quickly than state-sponsored actors probably can, since state-sponsored actors have to, kind of adhere to government kind of protocols and still probably have a level of bureaucracy internally. That might mean that cyber criminals are able to kind of just speed up their processes a bit quicker. So then it's easier to utilize something that's already, been developed really quickly rather than having to take the, months or however long it takes to develop certain things before implementing it. So it's really interesting. And then just kind of before we let go, the final point you made in your report related to financially motivated operations by state-sponsored actors utilizing cyber criminal tactics and infrastructure and other tools is definitely an interesting point. Can you just kind of expand on that, please, for our listeners?
Yeah, of course. So this is the last point really is looking at state-sponsored groups that already conduct financially motivated operations outside of this whole idea of increased cooperation with cybercriminal groups, of which we do have evidence over the last decade or so, specifically from, and I would say primarily from Chinese and North Korean state-sponsored actors. So just to quote a couple of examples, one recent example in June 2024 was a Chinese state-sponsored group that used a custom ransomware payload. And the motivation behind using this specific payload was to create disruption in kind of the targeted systems, as well as erase evidence of the attack, which obviously, again, complicated attribution and increased the likelihood of misattribution of this operation. But also, we do know that it was used also to then garner profit. And this kind of tactic is used by other Chinese state-sponsored groups as well, in which we have one in particular called APT41, where they tend to conduct financially motivated operations outside of Chinese working hours alongside cyber espionage operations. And it is likely that this group in particular uses financially motivated operations to harvest kind of additional resources in an independent way to then develop their skill set, develop more sophisticated malware. And then we can't really talk about state-sponsored financially motivated operations without mentioning the North Koreans that do routinely target global entities, global organizations in large-scale sort of cryptocurrency, financially motivated operations. This is very much tied to North Korea's sort of strategic objectives, which is obviously to support the weapons program, and in a way at the same time kind of counter ongoing economic sanctions and also the pretty dire conditions of the North Korean economy. So we do already know that state-sponsored groups engage in these types of activities. However, looking at the broader picture of increased cooperation with cyber criminals and everything that we've talked about so far in terms of use of cyber criminal tactics and tools, we do assess that it is likely that this will then strengthen and also diversify the skill set and workforce of state-sponsored groups, which in this case could result in an increase in financially motivated operations and also a bigger impact of these financially motivated operations, as we do know that state-sponsored groups already kind of moonlight in financially motivated operations, and just kind of that incentive and that like knowledge and capability increasing thanks to this kind of increased sharing of cybercriminal tactics and tools to really just develop better resources and sort of garner profit to then be able to develop better malware, better resources, better skill set as well.
It's definitely a complex threat landscape for businesses to kind of protect against, because even understanding some of the primary motivations for a lot of state-sponsored actors is, espionage, monitoring, pre-positioning, but the fact that there's also an element of financially motivated operations and the financial risks also associated, compounded by the security disruption and cyber espionage risks that they're facing. It's definitely more complex for businesses to not just have to worry about cyber criminals with trying to steal their money, but also state-sponsored actors and being able to trace that, and then kind of the ramifications of state actors potentially accessing, strategic bank accounts, things like that. Definitely interesting. A bit, it's not ideal for businesses, but it's definitely great to understand at least the evolution of these tactics. So at least we can try to, mitigate as much as possible. But thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time, especially in 2 parts. This has been really, really fascinating. I look forward to reading your sub. And for our subscribers who have access to our platform, it is accessible to read this situation update brief on our Astra platform. So I highly recommend others go and read it as well. Thank you so much for listening to this episode on the Insight Podcast. If you found this interesting, please do subscribe on the platform which you tend to take in this podcast. We greatly look forward to seeing you the next time.